James had lived in the same apartment for years. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. The building was old, yet well-maintained, sitting in a quiet neighborhood where most people kept to themselves. He paid his rent on time, never caused trouble, and treated his neighbors with respect. James worked hard at his job, often putting in extra hours to secure a stable future. He didn't expect special treatment, just fairness. For years, everything had been peaceful. That changed when Mr. Wilson took over as the new property manager. At first, James didn't think much of him. Mr. Wilson was an older man with a stern face and a sharp tongue. He was known for being strict, but James assumed as long as he followed the rules, there wouldn't be a problem. He was wrong. It started subtly. Mr. Wilson would ignore James whenever he greeted him in the hallway. If James needed a repair, it took weeks, sometimes months, while other tenants got help right away. Then the complaints began. Mr. Wilson accused James of being too loud, even though he barely made any noise. He claimed James's apartment was messy, despite never stepping inside. James brushed it off at first, thinking it was a misunderstanding. But as time passed, it became clear. Mr. Wilson was targeting him. The rules seemed different for James compared to the other tenants. The harassment became more frequent, more aggressive. James started to feel uneasy in his own home. Something wasn't right, and soon things would only get worse. At first, James tried to ignore the tension. Maybe Mr. Wilson was just strict with everyone. Maybe it wasn't personal. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear. This was different. One morning, James found a note taped to his door. Lease violation notice. The reason? Unauthorized guests. James was confused. He lived alone. He rarely had visitors, and when he did, they never stayed long. He knocked on Mr. Wilson's office door to clear up the misunderstanding. Mr. Wilson barely looked at him. "Rules are rules," he said, flipping through a file. "But I haven't broken any rules," James insisted. Mr. Wilson smirked. "That's not what I heard." James walked away, frustrated but calm. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone reported the wrong apartment. But then it happened again. Another notice. Noise complaint. James barely made any noise. He wasn't the one throwing late-night parties or blasting music. Those tenants never seemed to get complaints. Only him. Neighbors started noticing too. An elderly woman from down the hall whispered to James one evening, "You know, he never bothers the others like this." A younger couple 2 doors down confirmed it. "We play music late all the time," they admitted. "Never got a warning." James decided to talk to Mr. Wilson again, hoping to settle things peacefully. "I just want to understand," James said, standing in the manager's office. "I pay rent on time. I follow the rules. Why are you singling me out?" Mr. Wilson leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "If you don't like it, you can leave." James clenched his fists but kept his voice steady. "I'm not leaving." Mr. Wilson's expression darkened. "We'll see about that." From that day forward, things got worse. James started getting more notices, some ridiculous, others outright lies. Trash left in the hallway, but James always took his trash out on time. Failure to pay rent, but James had receipts proving otherwise. Property damage, but nothing in his apartment was broken. James realized what was happening. Mr. Wilson wanted to push him out, and he was willing to lie to make it happen. Then, the rent increase came. A letter arrived in James's mailbox. "Your monthly rent is increasing by $200, effective immediately." James asked around. None of the other tenants had received the same notice. Just him. He went to Mr. Wilson's office one last time. "Why is my rent going up?" "Market changes," Mr. Wilson said flatly. "But no one else's rent went up," James pointed out. Mr. Wilson shrugged. "Take it or leave it." James knew exactly what this was. Discrimination. Instead of reacting in anger, James did something else. He documented everything. He saved every letter, every notice, every complaint. He recorded interactions. He kept receipts, emails, and timestamps. He even got statements from neighbors who had witnessed Mr. Wilson's behavior. James wasn't going to fight this with words. He was going to fight it with evidence. And soon he would get the chance. 1. Evening, James returned home to find a bright red paper taped to his door. Eviction notice. He unfolded it with shaky hands, his heart pounding. Tenant is in violation of multiple lease agreements and is considered a problem tenant, must vacate the premises within 30 days. James felt his stomach drop. A problem tenant? That was a lie, and he knew it. He had never missed rent, never damaged the property, never broken a single rule. He stormed into Mr. Wilson's office, holding up the notice. "What is this?" Mr. Wilson barely looked up. "You have a month to move out." "For what reason?" James demanded. Mr. Wilson sighed, acting bored. "Repeated violations. I don't have to explain myself." James gritted his teeth. "I have proof. I've paid rent on time, followed the rules, and never caused trouble. This is discrimination." Mr. Wilson smirked. "Call it whatever you want. You're still leaving." James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "No, I'm not." Mr. Wilson's expression darkened. He stood up, stepping closer. "Then I'll take this to court," he sneered. "And trust me, you won't win." James left the office feeling angry but determined. He wasn't going to let this man bully him out of his home. Word spread quickly through the building. "That's not right," one of his neighbors, Mrs. Carter, said. "We've seen how he treats you. It's not fair." Others agreed. Some tenants admitted they had heard Mr. Wilson making racist remarks before. Others said they noticed how he treated James differently. "You should fight this," a young couple told him. "Take him to court." James nodded. That's exactly what he planned to do. That night, James sat at his desk, sorting through every piece of evidence he had collected. Rent receipts? All accounted for. Complaint notices? He had copies. Text messages and emails? Saved. Videos of Mr. Wilson ignoring him or treating him unfairly? Recorded. Statements from neighbors? They were willing to testify. James knew he needed a professional, so, the next morning, he contacted a lawyer. "I have proof that my landlord is discriminating against me," he explained over the phone. The lawyer listened carefully. After a pause, they said, "You have a strong case. Let's fight this." And just like that, it was official. James wasn't running. He was taking Mr. Wilson to court. The day had arrived. James sat in the courtroom, his lawyer beside him. Across from him sat Mr. Wilson, looking calm and confident, as if he had already won. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "This case is regarding the eviction of Mr. James Williams by the property manager, Mr. Richard Wilson," the judge announced. "Let's begin." James took a deep breath. He was ready. Mr. Wilson's lawyer stood first. He walked to the center of the room, adjusting his tie before speaking. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. My client, Mr. Wilson, is a responsible property manager. His job is to ensure that all tenants follow the rules. Unfortunately, Mr. Williams has repeatedly violated his lease agreement. He has received multiple complaints from neighbors and has failed to pay rent on time. He is disruptive and disrespectful. My client had no choice but to evict him." James clenched his jaw. Lies. Mr. Wilson took the stand. "I've managed properties for years," he said, shaking his head. "I treat all my tenants the same. But Mr. Williams? He's been a problem since day one." He went on, listing complaints that James knew were completely false: loud parties, damaged property, missing rent payments. "He's making the building unsafe," Mr. Wilson concluded. I had no choice but to evict him. James's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence that tells a very different story. James's lawyer approached the judge with a stack of documents. We have proof that my client, James Williams, has paid his rent on time every single month. We also have witness statements from multiple tenants, all confirming that Mr. Wilson has treated him unfairly compared to other residents. The judge looked over the documents. The lawyer continued. We also have video footage of Mr. Wilson ignoring maintenance requests from my client while assisting other tenants immediately. This suggests clear bias. James watched as Mr. Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then came the moment that changed everything. The lawyer handed a printed email to the judge. This is an email from Mr. Wilson to the property owner, sent 3 months ago. In it, he complains about having certain types of people in the building. He specifically names my client. A murmur spread through the courtroom. James could see Mr. Wilson's face turning red, but it wasn't over yet. The lawyer turned to the judge. Additionally, we found that this is not the first time Mr. Wilson has attempted to evict a black tenant using false claims. The judge raised an eyebrow. Explain. James's lawyer stepped forward. We obtained records from a previous property Mr. Wilson managed. He attempted to evict another black tenant 2 years ago using the exact same tactics: false noise complaints, fabricated lease violations, and sudden rent increases. That tenant filed a lawsuit, but the case was settled before trial. The judge looked directly at Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson, is this true? Mr. Wilson shifted in his seat. That has nothing to do with this case, he muttered. But the damage was done. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Wilson, in all these eviction cases, do you have any actual proof of wrongdoing? Mr. Wilson's lawyer tried to intervene. Your Honor. I'm asking Mr. Wilson, the judge interrupted. Mr. Wilson swallowed hard. I received complaints, he stammered. The judge nodded. Where are these complaints? Do you have signed statements, noise violation reports, security footage? Silence. The judge flipped through the documents. According to this evidence, Mr. Williams has paid his rent on time, has no history of damage, and has multiple neighbors willing to testify in his favor. Meanwhile, you have no actual records of his alleged violations. So tell me, Mr. Wilson, what exactly was the reason for this eviction? Mr. Wilson didn't answer. The tension in the courtroom was thick. James could feel it. Mr. Wilson was losing, and the verdict was coming soon. The courtroom was silent as the judge shuffled through the papers one last time. Mr. Wilson sat stiffly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. James, on the other hand, sat with his back straight, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, the judge looked up. I have reviewed all the evidence presented in this case, he began, his voice firm. And the facts are clear. James held his breath. This eviction is unlawful. A murmur spread through the room. Mr. Wilson's face twisted in disbelief. The judge continued. The plaintiff, Mr. James Williams, has provided clear and undeniable proof that he has paid his rent on time, followed all lease agreements, and has never violated building rules. Meanwhile, the defendant, Mr. Richard Wilson, has failed to provide any solid evidence to support his claims. James felt relief wash over him, but the judge wasn't done. This court does not tolerate racial discrimination. The evidence shows a pattern of unfair treatment by Mr. Wilson against Mr. Williams. Additionally, records indicate that this is not the first time Mr. Wilson has used false claims to evict black tenants. Mr. Wilson shifted in his seat. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he barely reacted. He was still in shock. The judge leaned forward, looking directly at Mr. Wilson. Not only is this eviction denied, but I am also ordering a full investigation into Mr. Wilson's actions as a property manager. Gasps echoed through the room. Mr. Wilson's lawyer jumped up. Your Honor, is that necessary? The judge raised an eyebrow. Do you have an objection to an investigation? The lawyer hesitated before sitting back down. James could see the panic in Mr. Wilson's eyes. He knew what was coming, but the judge wasn't finished. He turned to James's lawyer. Mr. Williams has endured months of harassment, unfair treatment, and emotional distress due to Mr. Wilson's actions. Therefore, this court orders Mr. Wilson to compensate Mr. Williams for damages. Mr. Wilson's mouth fell open. "Compensate?" he blurted out. The judge ignored him. Mr. Wilson is to pay $25,000 in damages to Mr. Williams for wrongful eviction attempts, racial discrimination, and emotional distress. Mr. Wilson jumped to his feet. "That's absurd. The judge banged his gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Wilson." He did, his face burning with humiliation. James couldn't believe it. He had won. As James stepped out of the courthouse, his neighbors surrounded him. "You did it!" Mrs. Carter cheered. "I knew you'd win," the young couple grinned. "It was so obvious he was lying." James smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. Meanwhile, Mr. Wilson stormed out, his face pale with anger. Reporters and legal investigators were already waiting for him. The building owners soon found out about the case. Within a month, Mr. Wilson was fired. His reputation was ruined. No one wanted to hire a property manager with a record of racial discrimination. James kept his home, but this case wasn't just about him. Other tenants, inspired by his courage, started speaking out. Complaints against unfair landlords increased. Local housing officials began cracking down on discrimination. James had won more than just a court case. He had won justice. James walked through the hallways of his apartment building, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. For months, he had lived under stress, wondering if he would be forced out of his home. But now the eviction case was over, and he had won. He still lived in the same apartment, but everything felt different. There were no more sudden rent increases, no more false complaints, and no more harassment from Mr. Wilson, because Mr. Wilson was gone. After losing in court, Mr. Wilson faced more than just humiliation. The judge's order for an investigation had serious consequences. Housing authorities dug deep into his past. They uncovered multiple cases where he had discriminated against Black and minority tenants. Some had been forced out. Others had settled in silence, afraid they couldn't win. Now their voices were finally being heard. Several former tenants came forward with lawsuits of their own. The case against Mr. Wilson grew bigger every week. Eventually, the building's owner had no choice but to fire him. But that wasn't all. The damage to his reputation was permanent. No property owner wanted to hire a manager with a record of racial discrimination and illegal eviction attempts. He had been so sure he would win. Instead, he lost everything. With Mr. Wilson gone, something amazing happened. Other tenants started speaking up. For years, people had stayed silent, afraid of retaliation. But after watching James fight back and win, they felt brave enough to tell their own stories. Some had been overcharged for rent. Some had been ignored when they needed repairs. Some had been harassed just like James. One by one, their voices built a powerful case against the building's management. The property owner, now under legal pressure, decided to sell the building to a new company. A better company, one that cared about fairness and followed the law. James knew his battle wasn't just about him. His victory meant something bigger. He started sharing his story, helping others who faced discrimination from landlords. He connected with housing rights organizations, learning how laws worked and how tenants could protect themselves. People reached out to him, asking for advice. Tenants from other buildings told him about similar experiences. Some were too afraid to speak up, but James encouraged them. "You don't have to be silent," he told them. "You have rights." Before he knew it, he was more than just a tenant. He had become a voice for fair housing. James's case gained attention beyond his neighborhood. Local news stations picked up the story. Reporters covered the trial, exposing Mr. Wilson's long history of discrimination. People all over the city were talking about it. Social media users shared the story, outraged that someone had gotten away with this for so long. Laws were already in place to protect tenants, but James's case showed that many landlords still tried to abuse their power. His victory inspired others to take action. Housing groups pushed for stronger protections against unfair evictions. Lawyers offered free consultations to tenants who suspected discrimination. More people came forward, filing complaints, demanding investigations. James had only wanted to keep his home, but his fight had helped countless others. One evening, James sat on his balcony, looking out over the city. He had gone through months of stress, fear, and uncertainty. But in the end, he had won. He had kept his home. He had fought back against injustice. He had helped expose a corrupt system. And he wasn't done yet. James knew there were more people out there, still facing the same struggle. And as long as landlords like Mr. Wilson existed, he would keep fighting, because no one should be treated unfairly in their own home. And now, because of his courage, fewer people would be.